Welcome to the Christian Men at Work podcast, where I interview men from all walks of life with varying job titles who have one thing in common. They are all choosing daily to live out their Christian faith through their work, and because of that, they are leading, prospering, glorifying God, and experiencing joy and purpose in their work. And you can too. Men at Work, welcome to episode 42. Before I get to our guest today, I want to share with you the first in a segment that I'm starting called a walking tip. Basically, at the beginning of each episode, I'm going to share with you some kind of an insight that I've had that has to do with my walk with the Lord, and that I hope will help you out. So this episode is Don't Let Fear Keep You from Trying the Unknown. And the verses I'm going to reference here are 1 John 4:18, perfect love casts out fear, and 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And there were many times when Jesus commanded us not to fear. I recently had two experiences where I tried something that I had avoided for a long time out of fear, and found after trying it that it was not nearly as bad or difficult as I thought it would be. One was in my professional life. I've been an engineer for almost 20 years and have avoided learning how to use AutoCAD, which is a software that allows you to create and read engineering drawings. It's never been a job requirement for me, but it's always something that would have been beneficial and something that I wanted to do. So just recently started watching some YouTube videos, and within about a half a day, I was able to create some just very basic drawings, and this will have a benefit to me and the work that I do. Personally, I've wanted to play the bass for many years. A few years ago, I bought a bass, but I felt intimidated by it, and I've hardly ever practiced it. But recently, I approached someone in the worship band at our church who played the bass, talked to them a little bit about it. They gave me some sheet music for the songs they played and some quick tips on playing along with them. And even though I was excited, I still was intimidated and didn't do anything with it. And then just recently, I took that first step and I started practicing, and I was surprised at how it was not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. So these are two instances that really spoke to me, and I hope that you will be encouraged to try something that you've been avoiding out of fear. So today I'm going to be talking with Dr. Jamie Aten. He is a disaster psychologist and founder and executive director of the Humanitarian Disaster Institute, HDI, at Wheaton College, who underwent his own personal disaster when at the age of 35 he was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. He's the author of the book A Walking Disaster, What Surviving Katrina and Cancer Taught Me About Faith and Resilience. Let's get right to our interview. Dr. Jamie Aten, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I'm just going to jump right in with my first question, which is, can you tell us about what your life was like prior to becoming a Christian, as well as when and how and why you became a Christian?
Well, thanks for having me. And when I reflect back on my faith walk, I actually grew up in a small little rural farming community of about 1,000 people where Christianity was very common. And I grew up actually in a Christian household, and still can remember my father reading sometimes us a story from the Bible. I remember this kind of bright orange kid's Bible that we had that he would read to us. And at age 8 is actually when I was baptized and accepted Christ. It was kind of funny because I remember on the day that I was baptized, later in the afternoon after church, asking my dad if it was okay if we still played catch. I didn't know, can we still do that sort of thing on this kind of a special day. But even though I grew up in the church, I don't think my faith truly became my own until I went to college. And it was my very first semester there, and I was at a junior college at the time and had written some paper. I don't even remember what it was, for an English class. And my professor had penciled in red ink at the top of the paper to come see him after class. So went and found him after class over at his office, and he asked me if I was a Christian, to which I said yes. And then after a slight pause, he asked me why. and I didn't have a strong answer for it, and I wasn't sure what to say. And so at that point in my life, I hadn't even actually read a book from front to cover. I wasn't the greatest student up until that point. And so I went to see my youth minister and told him about what had happened. And he loaded me up. Like I'll never forget, the stack of books that, I had my hands down below my waist, and it was all the way up to my chin of all these books he gave me to read. And the first one that I opened up was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And I just went straight through that whole book, and from that point never stopped reading. And once a week I would get together with this professor, and I would share with him C.S. Lewis or some other book I was reading about Christianity. And he was an agnostic, sometimes teetering on atheism, sometimes a little bit into Eastern spirituality. And he would give me a book on one of those topics to read, and we'd get together and kind of challenge each other and think through these different issues. So if you can be mentored as a Christian by an agnostic, I was.
And I think that's the first testimony where I've heard that. But well, I mean, we're not just supposed to be in a Christian bubble, whether we're witnessing to others or, I guess, being mentored by them. It's we should be out talking to and being around everybody. So that's a cool testimony.
Yeah, it really helped me to really start thinking about my faith more deeply in ways that I'd just never been challenged to. And then eventually went on to the university to study and had a campus minister there, Mark Gallagher, who was just super influential, where I kind of continued that tradition of getting together once a week. And he took me under his wing, and we would go to a little local Mexican restaurant every week, and we would have chips and salsa and a question of the day over lunch. And so it was a really great time to, be taken under the wing of a strong Christian leader like that.
Well, if we talked about nothing else, I just got a lot from that. This whole issue of mentoring just seems to be coming up for me anyway a lot this last year, and God's been putting it on my heart both to be mentored and to mentor others. So that's a cool testimony to reinforce that. So thanks. So, the focus of our podcast is around faith and work. I want to spend most of our time talking about your book, so I don't think we're going to spend a whole lot of time digging into some of the faith work issues necessarily, but I do want to ask you this question. What do you do for a living? And talk real quickly about kind of your different work experiences that led up to what you do now.
Sure. So currently, I'm the founder and executive director of the Humanitarian Disaster Institute at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. And I also teach in our HDI's master's program in humanitarian and disaster leadership. But before I got to this point in my career, I initially, when I was going through graduate school, worked as a youth minister for a couple of years part-time, did some work in campus ministry, and then went on to psychology. I got a PhD in counseling psychology. And then my first job right out of graduate school, I moved to teach in a doctoral program of psychology at the University of Southern Mississippi. So for folks that aren't familiar with USM, that's where Brett Favre played college ball and where Jimmy Buffett failed out of.
I didn't know about Jimmy Buffett, but I did recognize it. I grew up in Wisconsin and was a big Brett Favre fan. So.
Oh yeah, Southern Miss, the Golden Eagles, and so a lot of people don't realize it about Jimmy Buffett. But so I went down there to teach because I thought I was going to do work in rural health disparities, and then 6 days after moving in, Hurricane Katrina struck my community. And so it just looked like a bomb had gone off where we lived in that area, with pine trees just skyrocketing through people's homes, and homes just completely leveled. Where all that was left was a slab. So the damage looked a lot different in Mississippi than what it did over in New Orleans. It was largely flooding damage there. And I ended up, after the university opened back up about a month or so after the storm, Southern Miss opened back up. And I remember our college president came to campus and said that whatever you were doing with your students before the hurricane, that's what I want to encourage you to do now. So I ended up getting my research team that I had met with the week before the Katrina struck and got them together. And we started talking about what kind of research might we do, because we were trying to find that way of helping our students just feel normal by getting back to some routines. And one of my students said, why aren't we focusing on doing research and helping right here in our community with Katrina? And so our team, we got together and started thinking about research and how research could help. And one of the things that we noticed was that local churches played a huge role of responding right after Katrina. And then when other groups over time left, it was still the local church that was helping. And we saw Christians from all over the world come in. But we also saw that some of the practices weren't always helpful. So I dedicated my research and training and work to helping after Katrina. And then from there, started doing all kinds of training around disaster mental health and research throughout the Southeast. And then that led to doing work over in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then that led to more international trauma type of work all over the globe. And then after 5 years there at Southern Miss, came up here to Wheaton College. And then after just a couple of years was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, which I'm grateful to be able to share now. It's been 4.5 years with no sign of disease.
Well, thanks for that overview. And it is very powerful the way you walk us through in your book, both your primarily your journey of your personal disaster, but also how you make parallels between that and these natural disasters. So let's talk about this cancer issue, because this is huge. I know part of what your testimony and what you have shared with us through the book. Give us a quick overview of the timeline, maybe, and kind of some key milestone events related to that experience. I realize that's hard to boil that down to a few bullet points, but just to kind of maybe catch the listeners up to speed.
Yeah, sure thing. And as we're talking too, that for me, one of the reasons I was excited about being on this podcast is because of the themes of work that definitely plays out in my own story and even the way I understood my cancer experience. Because when I was first diagnosed and I was meeting with my oncologist, and he's breaking the news to me that, yes, this is indeed cancer. It's really advanced. It's spread from the colon to a mass in your pelvis. And, I'm sitting there in the consulting room and, I'm starting to tear up and I'm having a hard time focusing. I can't wrap my head around what he's saying. And it kind of sounded a little bit like, you remember the Charlie Brown cartoon where the parents are talking, everything's kind of muffled. It is kind of what that moment was like. And so he tries to, bring me back into the conversation by asking me what I do for a living. And I share that, well, I'm a professor over at Wheaton College. I also direct this disaster research center. And he pauses for a moment and with his best bedside manner says that, well, you're in for your own personal disaster. And he was right. And even though that was really hard for me to get my head around, framing what I was going through as a disaster helped kind of me think about how would I tell a community to navigate, recovery. And so it kind of helped give me a bit of a roadmap. And then over the course of my cancer experience, I ended up having a year-long worth of treatment. So that first summer, I did oral chemo twice a day, plus radiation daily, and did that for about 3 months. And then just as soon as I started to recover a little bit from that, I had a major surgery where they ended up removing all the cancer and anything else they felt like, could have maybe been carrying cancer cells. And then I was bedridden for just about a month or so where I couldn't hardly do anything. Like I couldn't even walk up, go to the bathroom on my own. I had to have somebody help me, with every step of the way. And then just as I started to finally start to get back on my feet a little bit around December, I found out that I was going to have another 6 months of not of oral chemo, but of drip chemo, and would have to go through that for 6 months. And so at the very end of it, I was so grateful to have that behind me. But throughout it, anytime I could try to find a little bit of space where maybe I was thinking clearly and it could work, that was one of the kind of footholds that made me still feel normal in such an abnormal time.
Yeah, wow. I almost felt like I was lacking in my own personal experience to relate to what you walked us through in your book, because it's pretty unique what you went through, and I'm sure those who've gone through cancer would have a unique perspective after reading it. But at the same time, I did feel like I got a lot out of it. And one of the lessons that I heard you mention or read that you mentioned about this whole concept of disasters was kind of a change from something you took from your childhood. And you talked about going through a tornado that set down near your home, and at the end of the disaster, you basically, the sun came out and life resumed as it had been before. And that was kind of how you thought about disasters. And one of the things you you took from your cancer experience was that sometimes disasters have long-lasting consequences, things that change our lives. Is that right?
Oh, most definitely. And, I remember after that experience that you're talking about that, eventually it felt like life got back to normal, that, I could go to Newton, Illinois, which is the town not too far from us that was really leveled by this tornado that had touched down out in some fields near where we lived. And remember that eventually all the buildings went back up. But what I didn't realize was how sometimes the debris may be left internally, even if we can't see it externally, like with the house.
Mm-hmm.
And in my own experience, what I've come to realize is that it's not just about surviving the disaster, whatever that may be. It could be a job crisis, it could be a health issue, and a mass disaster like a tornado. But there's also this, I'm learning that you have to learn how to survive survivorship. That for some people, life may not ever go back exactly to how it was. And so you have to kind of learn how to pick up the pieces and honor the struggle that you've been through and still find a way to move forward.
One of the things you talked about was this concept of an SUV. And you talked about a specific example of someone who was well-intentioned, but didn't maybe get the right result in how they said something to you. And it struck me because I thought this was one application to the workplace, because all of us at one time come across other people who are going through their own personal disaster. And I thought it was interesting, your thoughts on that. Can you tell us what an SUV is? Maybe some advice for maybe some right ways and wrong ways of talking to others, both that we're close to as well as just acquaintances who are going through their own disasters?
Sure. I consult quite often with different businesses and ministries and organizations in the disaster humanitarian work that they do. And, so you've got groups that are doing like repairing homes, some that are doing like property mitigation types of stuff, others selling insurance. And one of the things I try to remind them that when it comes to a tragedy, that no matter what job or ministry or work that you're doing, at the end of the day, any interaction that you have is a human interaction. It's not just the disaster. That at its heart, disasters affect, our humanity. And you're going to end up interacting with people in these very difficult times. And so even if it's just at the office and somebody loses a loved one, it can help us to be prepared of how can we respond in a way that's going to help them rather than hurt them. And by the SUV term, what I was talking about there was a spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteer. So that's a language that we use a lot in the disaster world, where emergency managers oftentimes talk about how there's a disaster within the disaster. And what they're meaning by that is that oftentimes you have volunteers that just kind of parachute in from all over, and they're not affiliated with any organization, and they actually add to the chaos. And I saw that same sort of thing play out during my cancer experience, that there were people that were well-meaning and wanted to help, but ended up actually making it much more difficult. So in an example in the disaster realm would be like, I remember this group, there was a church up north somewhere that raised about $60,000 of funds, and they rented a semi truck and filled the whole back end with frozen microwavable meals. And so they sent those down to South Mississippi. Well, once they got down there was no electricity. So not only could you not, heat these things up to eat, but because of that, there was also no electricity to be able to keep them cold. So $60,000 worth of food spoiled on the side of the road down there. And so that's kind of that example of an SUV.
Yeah.
Well, in the particular instance that you're asking me about in my cancer experience, I was getting a scan after my diagnosis just to see if the cancer had spread anywhere else in the body that maybe wasn't picked up from the initial test. And so I'm going in for a PET scan, and it's kind of like this little cave, and I'm laying on the old table there, and they roll me in. And about that time, I realized I'm going to have to go home and tell my 3 daughters that daddy's got cancer. And I did everything opposite than what that little voice, if you've ever had one of those scans, tells you, which is, hold your breath, don't move, be still. Well, I lost it. I mean, it was like a whole body shaking sob that was happening as I was picturing my girls. And all of a sudden I realized that the test stopped, and I'm slowly kind of pulled back out of this like cave of the PET scan. And as I'm still sobbing, that tech who is running the machine doesn't say anything, and she just puts her hand on my shoulder. And in that moment, it felt like a sacred moment that it helped me realize I'm not alone. There's other people still with me. There's people trying to help me. But then she became an SUV when she opened her mouth. And she goes on to say, well, Jamie, God only tests the strong. And then she goes on to say, well, at least you don't have it as bad as when I had cancer. And I was just kind of astonished. Like, I couldn't believe she was saying this. Now, I think because of what I do, and, I go around all over the country, talking about how to help and things, that in that moment, instead of getting angry, I just thought to myself, hey, now I've got the perfect example of what not to say when a personal disaster. So my sense of humor kind of helped me in that moment. But then I started thinking afterwards of like, wait a minute, if she told that to me, I wonder if she's told this to other cancer patients or other people that she's worked with, that maybe this would have been a lot more hurtful to. So one of the things I always try to encourage others, if you're wanting to help someone, is to show up and be present, because your presence will say more than any words you could ever say.
So be present, but maybe don't say too much. That might be one way of saying it, huh?
Yeah, and so I just wrote an article that just came out in Fox News. So if you just Google my name in Fox News, on this exact topic of what to say or not to say, and one of the things that I would encourage people not to say are kind of what I often have referred to as bumper sticker theology sayings. So these are like platitudes, that we say not necessarily to help the other person, but because we don't know what to say.
Right.
In those cases, it's better not to say anything, or ask them how how are they doing? How can you help? Provide that tangible support to them will go a long way.
Right. For one thing, it's kind of just a common phrase that might kind of almost like cheapen, like you said, a sacred moment. But I guess the other issue is that there might be a theological concern from the person you talk to. In other words, what you say might go against what they believe, and so I can see
Yeah.
a lot of ways that could be problematic.
Well, and the other thing that I've seen, is first of all, I think if you can fit what you're saying on a bumper sticker that's going to go on the back of your car, it probably doesn't have a lot of deep theological meaning, anyways, right?
Right.
But the other part, when I reflect not only on my experience, but if I think about all the others that we've studied or that we've helped after disasters, I've never heard somebody in the middle of a crisis asking you, God, why would you let this happen? And somebody just walk up and be like, let me pull out this book of apologetics and explain it to you all.
Yeah.
And then that person be like, oh, everything's better now.
Right.
In that moment, we're going to speak to them more by just honoring the struggle they're going through, and be patient. There may be a time to talk more deeply about these questions, but you're probably not honestly going to have an answer that's going to make that pain stop.
Well, you talked about how your faith journey evolved throughout your life, from more intellectual, both as a child and as a young man. And I think the example that you talked about with the atheist mentor you had, that was part of that kind of intellectual development, but then it evolved to more of an emotional one. And it seemed like your cancer experience was actually a part of that, that transition for you. Well, before I ask my next question, is what I said accurate so far?
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Okay. So the reason I wanted to ask this was because it gets to something that's been on my has been a part of my journey, which is what I've found is there's a lot of difference among Christians around this issue of bad things happening to good people, and how to make sense of that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard theological differences from pastors as well as from other believers all over the map. Anything from, if it's bad, it didn't come from God, to people saying they actually thank God for suffering. And honestly, I don't have it. No one's got it all figured out, and I'm still working through this for sure, this question. But with that kind of as a backdrop, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because the way I interpreted what you said was that you said that in some ways we can connect to God at an emotional level through our suffering because he suffered. And I wanted you just to talk about that. Is that a true statement from your perspective, and kind of what other insights do you have around this whole issue of, the benefits you might say of suffering?
Yeah, it's I think when it comes to this, it can be a very murky territory and kind of understanding it. So if I can kind of hit on a couple points there that I think you were bringing up, I grew in the tradition I grew up in. It was very much more of a kind of a cognitive faith or a mental faith where emotions were actually thought to be bad, and they lead to dancing, and then that's going to get you into all kinds of trouble, right? And and I still can have this kind of mental image where as a kid one Sunday morning there was a fellow that I knew that his son was my age, and his dad kind of raised his hand, almost like you were doing like being sworn in at a ceremony. That's about as high. And for like a month everybody in the church I grew up in was like, can you believe how charismatic he is? So that's the tradition I'm kind of coming out of, right, growing
Right.
up. So I'd never really thought about my faith in a very deeply kind of emotional way. But one of the things that happened with me with cancer was that the chemotherapy just beat me down, and the surgery beat me down with the suffering that I was going through, to the point where, maybe I would have an hour that on a good day that I could think clearly. Sometimes it would just be, a handful of minutes where I felt like I could think the way that I used to. There was one time where my wife and I was thankful because I wasn't able to go to church very often either during my cancer, because one, I physically couldn't go, or because my cancer or my blood cells and stuff were so low that I couldn't be around others for infection, that sort, potential infection. And there was this one Sunday morning in Bible school or Sunday school where we were talking about things, and I remember like offering up a quote from a philosopher, and I was like, oh my goodness, like I've not had this type of thinking capacity forever. And then I went to go use the restroom, and I come out and I realized I had just walked out of the women's restroom. So, my thinking wasn't all there. And so I couldn't experience God in the same way. But what I started realizing was by, through prayer and by worship, even on my own, in my own time, that I was feeling God's presence in an emotional way that I had never experienced before. So it was very powerful for me.
Just theologically, do you feel like that you believe that although God can work all things for good, and he does work all things for good, that we shouldn't necessarily say that just because something bad happened that it was God's will? I mean, that's how I feel about it. And would you
Yeah,
agree with that statement?
yeah, definitely. Like early on, because I was struggling with a lot of why questions, like why is this happening? Why is this occurring to me?
Right.
And I had remembered a book at the time that I had read some years before, where it kind of talks about like the theology of there was a large tsunami. I can't remember now if it was India or Indonesia where it happened, but one of the things this theologian points out is that when we think of disasters, we tend to think of just what's happening in the here and now. But when we think about, if we step back and look at it from a biblical narrative, the suffering that we're going through is part of the fall. And so it helps us to kind of step back to remember that, I don't think God's up there in heaven like those Far Side cartoons, waiting for you to walk by and pushing a button on a computer that's going to drop a piano on you because you took a wrong step.
Right.
And I do think God can work through that suffering and redeem our suffering. That's really kind of the key theme of the book that I've written. But I think it is important to remember kind of the big picture, but then even to go to the scriptures and look where Christ talks. I think it's in Romans, where somebody comes up and says, Rabbi, is this person blind because they've sinned or their parents? And he quickly responds back that it's neither of them, and kind of scolds them for saying that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a powerful passage to address this issue. That along with the Romans 8:28. Yeah, I agree. You talked about how initially I appreciate how authentic you were about when you first found out about your cancer. you were angry and you wanted justice in some way, and you talked about how thought about pursuing legal action against a doctor who had misdiagnosed you, and then you kind of had a change of heart about that. What I guess advice do you give to those who are going through a disaster and they have those feelings, what to do with those feelings of, wanting to get, maybe not even is the right word, but just wanting to get justice?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a place for justice, and I oftentimes think about Micah 6:8, about seeking justice and but loving mercy and walking humbly. And one of the things that I realized initially that I wanted that why question answered so badly that and I felt so much I was very angry that I was misdiagnosed. So for listeners that aren't aware, one of the things I hadn't shared was I had gone to a specialist a year prior to my diagnosis, and that doctor more or less told me eat some more, drink some more fiber in your diet, and if the symptoms come back, we'll do some more testing. Well, the symptoms came back a year later, and it was stage 4 cancer. So I was misdiagnosed. So I was feeling upset about that. But when I reflected on Micah 6:8, one of the things I realized was I wasn't looking for biblical justice, right, which should be accompanied by mercy and also humility. That I was just upset. And the other thing that I realized was from some research that a colleague had done after the Exxon Valdez oil spill was that he had found that people that had chronic health issues who involved in litigation, which was drawn out, it was years and years of litigation, that a lot of those individuals struggled even more from a health perspective. So I don't want to say, I'm not saying don't take legal action, because I do think there are times and situations when we need to do that. But in my particular instance, I realized I was angry, and that if I put all my energy into to fight the battle of cancer, so we kind of have to learn to walk that balance beam.
Well, that's the power of forgiveness too, is a big part of that, isn't it?
Oh, most definitely. I think that's one of the other stories that I share there that was also reminded about. We did some research after the civil conflict and genocide in Liberia, and we followed up with people. It was like, I think about 20 years after the event, and we found that people who had come to a place of being able to forgive, and think about this context, right? Like, we're talking about where your neighbor may have killed one of your family members, or that a neighbor may be the person that actually dismembered, your arm or something. So like, this is the context that we're looking at. And what we found was that people that were able to forgive doesn't mean they didn't seek justice, but that they forgave, that they had much better health outcomes and spiritual outcomes as a result.
That's very powerful. You talked about the value of being open with others about your deepest wounds. I wanted to talk about this because I thought this was pretty a big deal. You talk about the first time you were open publicly about something that was very personal, and I'll let you comment it if you want to. But I wanted to quote you from your book, and you said that basically you were glad that you did that, and you said that we are forever changed by what we endured. We can let our wounds wall us off from others, or we can use our wounds as doorways through which we invite others to enter and share our most true, authentic self. And I thought that was huge. And so can you, if you're willing, could you share that story and just talk about the value of being open about personal things like that?
Yeah, and it's one of those issues that I think is really tricky, and it's something that I still struggle with on a regular basis. So I want to make sure that folks know that I don't have my act all together here, but it's definitely something that I felt that cancer helped open me up to. That the big takeaway from me was that we can either let our pain divide us or unite us. Oftentimes, when we're struggling, we end up isolating ourselves from others. But when we are struggling, that's actually when we need people the most. And I found that really hard. And, I think this kind of ties in to your interest with work and faith, that, for me, a big part of what I do in my work and my ministry is helping others. And that's also where I find a lot of my own personal identity, even my spiritual identity. And so when cancer threatened to kind of rob that I went from being the helper to the helpee, and I wanted to withdraw from people. But over time, I realized that that's really when we need to let others into our life. And now when we do that and how we do it is going to look different for each person and from situation to situation. But one of the things that I've seen in the trauma work that we've done around the globe is that by telling our story to others, it helps us gain mastery over that trauma or over that event. So, for example, I can remember after Katrina, we were working in like the soup kitchen area, and there was this fellow coming in. And as he went down the line with almost every person that he engaged with, he would tell them the same story over, and the next person, same story again and again and again. And what I realized was that telling helped him to wrap his head around what he was going through. So I do encourage others to seek out and share, but do so in a way that is with somebody who's safe and who's going to honor your story and in which you feel comfortable revealing things to others. So if you look at the publication date of my book, versus when I finished my cancer experience, that's like 4.5 years. And going into the story that you're highlighting, I was giving a talk to a group of cancer survivors, and it was a couple years after my last treatment, and I revealed with them that I had a major surgery, and expressed the full extent of what I was going through. And that was the first time I had ever uttered that to anyone that wasn't like my closest friends or family members. And so, I'm not saying for people just to go out and be like, hey, world, here's, everything that I'm struggling with, but to find people that you are close with and to start to share. And, I appreciate how you even gave me the opportunity here of like what to share or not to share. And, in this particular moment, I think it's because I've been doing several interviews the last couple of days that like, I don't know that I can share that verbally, but I can share it in writing, if that makes sense. So I think it's important to know where you're at and what kind of space that you're in.
You talked about experiencing survivor guilt as part of this experience and some really difficult experiences where you knew people close who did not have the same after story that you did, and specifically people who died, or people who had family members who died. I'm going to say just how I responded to this. I hope you don't mind me interjecting my own personal bit here, but the way I've experienced survivor guilt, at least the way I interpret it, more so than anything else, is that most of my disasters personally have been self-imposed. Okay, just sins that I committed as a young man that have carried through and had negative consequences. So my question for you on this topic is, for those who experience survivor guilt in the way that you did, where they went through something difficult but made it, but then know people who didn't, as well as people, and maybe there's a larger percentage who maybe fall into my category of just people who just made a lot of bad choices. They reaped negative consequences, or maybe they know people who didn't make bad choices but still reap negative consequences. I don't know if that's making any sense, but
Yeah.
but I guess anything in that, any thoughts you have around that whole issue of survivor guilt, either because you didn't have to experience the negative consequences that someone else did, or maybe you did, but you feel like you deserved it because you made you kind of brought it on yourself.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And in fact, like I think we can kind of even dissect that a little bit, like from a scientific perspective, that, so if you look at survivor's guilt being where, you've gone through something that likely others have, and you come out of it and maybe you're better off than others, that's kind of where that guilt comes from. And then the part that I was kind of hearing you talk about, like where maybe you had actions and you've got guilt because of something that happened in your life. A colleague of mine, Dr. Everett Worthington, who used to be a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, is one of the world's leading forgiveness researchers. And I just did an interview with him for Psychology Today about forgiveness. And one of the things that he teases out is, in the same way that it's helpful to forgive other people, we also need to practice self-forgiveness. And so I can share you that link afterwards if you want to share that with listeners, that where he kind of dissects what goes into forgiving ourselves and really cultivating self-compassion for maybe mistakes that we've made in our own lives. And when it comes to survivor's guilt, I think it's really important that that we remember that that type of guilt is sometimes normal. I lost 3 people that were close to me from that all had very similar types of cancer as I did. I was the only one to still make it. And it took me a while to understand that it was survivor's guilt that I was struggling with. But once I was able to be aware of that, I was sharing with a good friend over coffee and breakfast one morning about it. And she reminded me that, yes, Jamie, you lost people in your life, but she's like, do you also know all the other people that had a similar type of cancer that lived? And she just starts sharing all these names of other people that also lived. And it helped me to realize that, it wasn't like I was the only one that made it, that there were other people. And it took a lot of prayer and time and lots of conversations with family and friends to start to work through that guilt.
I'm just going to expand on this a little bit. Again, not to make this too personal, but I just went to the March for Life, and I've been open in the past with the fact that I participated in abortion when I was a young man, and so this is really still raw for me after going to the March for Life last week, and I've had some powerful interviews on this topic, but that's kind of where it hits home for me. It's like I survived that abortion, and the child did not. And so, that maybe that's the way I've connected with your book, maybe more than anything else. So, just because I haven't had a health disaster the way you have, but a lot of the lessons that I read about in your book kind of applied to me in that way.
Yeah, well, and like in my case, one of the things that I also learned from my survivor's guilt was that it went from something that was really hurtful to me to even an unhealthy coping mechanism. So not to sound like, one of the things that I realized was that guilt, I didn't want to give it up, because in some ways I almost kind of wanted to self-punish a bit, like I didn't feel like I deserved to still be here when, I lost these friends. And then the other part was, once I realized that if I let go of that guilt, I was also going to have to acknowledge the shame that I had in my life. And there was this particular experience where a good friend of mine, that after I was okay and he had cancer, it got to the point where I was kind of withdrawing from him, and then ended up losing him, and realized that I was avoiding him because it was caused me too much anxiety to think about, what if it comes back to me? What if I have cancer again? And there was just this deep sense of shame and sorrow that I had. But eventually, by acknowledging it, that was a huge piece of helping me to actually get on the other side. So, sometimes that survivor's guilt, sometimes, that's not even always the full issue. Sometimes it's actually what's even below that. And in my case, it was having to take ownership of shame, and for the way that I could have walked better with a dear friend.
Wow. All right. So I hope this doesn't feel like it's too much of a drinking from a fire hose. I know I've had just a bunch of questions in a short period of time, but there is something else from your book that I thought was really powerful that I want to ask you about before we wrap things up, and it was this the fact that you came to an understanding of the difference between 3 different virtues: endurance, resilience, and fortitude, and the way you walked through how you experienced those in your journey, I thought was really cool. Can you explain to us the difference between those 3 virtues and how we can apply those in our lives with our own, personal disasters?
Yeah, sure. I've spent my career researching resilience, and I'm an advocate of resilience. And when I was going through cancer, so if you think about like a disaster, right? Like when Katrina went over our home, it passed by in the matter of minutes, right? But like when cancer came into my life, it was like having a hurricane hovering over me for over a year. So there was some pretty serious like debris left over in my own life from it. And one of the ways that people oftentimes talk about resilience is about our ability to bounce back after adversity. Kind of like if you took a beach ball and you push it underwater and it bounces back. That's kind of the imagery a lot of people associate with resilience. And when I was going through my cancer battle and really beaten down, where I felt like it was hard for me to contribute things in my life, that I had a number of people say, Jamie, I really appreciate your resilience. And I felt like I couldn't accept those words, that I felt like I know the definition of what resilience is, and my experience does not, isn't congruent with the way that we often talk about resilience, or how I had even talked about it as a scholar in this area. And then after I found out that I didn't have cancer, it took me, goodness, it was somewhere around like 9 months or more before I finally got back to kind of more normal. I don't like that word because I think normal is a setting on a washing machine. But, kind of got back, to where I was in many ways, like cognitively and, my ability to think and be active to some extent. And I was like, that doesn't meet the definition of resilience. Like, this was a long, drawn out, battle for me, and I'm exhausted and beaten down. There was no bounce that happened in my life. And I started really studying scripture and speaking with philosophers and theologians of trying to understand what was it that helped me through this. But it was something slightly different than just resilience. And, part of it was an endurance, like we see like the virtue of endurance in scripture. But I still felt like there was something more. And then that's when I discovered, it's not that I discovered, I mean, it's taught throughout church history, but about the virtue of spiritual fortitude, which can be thought as the virtue of facing adversity. And the way that I kind of distinguish between resilience and spiritual fortitude is resilience is our focus to be able to get on the other side of adversity, to get back to life, where spiritual fortitude allows us to find life even amidst the suffering. And so you can kind of think of spiritual fortitude as our ability to kind of metabolize suffering and to still try to do good, even when we are beaten down and the odds are against us.
So we're not just waiting it out.
No, yeah, and that's the struggle. And like I can remember, like when I first found out I had to do chemo and radiation for the summer that first year, I remember thinking to myself, it's just a summer. I can put my head down and I can just push through this and pile through this and get to the end of summer and I'll finally be okay. And then it was finding out, okay, nope, now I've got to go through a surgery. So it's like, if I can just put my head down and keep pushing forward and get through the surgery. And I did that, not very well, but I finally got to the other end and I thought, finally, it's over. And then that's when my oncologist tells me, no, you've got 6 more months of chemo. And I was like, I can't do it. And like, I actually pushed back against it. I said, I'm not going to do it. You go find me the science and prove to me. I want clinical trial data that shows that that's the best thing. And, like, he even like called me on my cell phone in the car on the way home, just to be like, Jamie, you've got to do this. Cause he knew that I didn't feel like I had the strength to endure another 6 months. And, I'd kind of always lived my life in the future and realized we have to live in the present, and spiritual fortitude helps us to do that, especially in times of adversity.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to be pursuing a better understanding of fortitude, in addition to what I've already gotten from your book, because that struck me as a very important virtue. So thanks for highlighting that. Well, I think our time is up here, so I'm going to ask you if you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that I would really end on is to also think about embracing humility during times of adversity. That, I just gave that example of where I had this kind of mindset that if I can, just kind of pull myself up by the bootstraps, I can push all the way through, this cancer journey. And I couldn't. And I think sometimes it can be difficult for us. And if we can understand humility, it means, so for instance, we're doing some research with the John Templeton Foundation right now, looking at humility among leaders. And what we're finding is that humility, from a research perspective, helps us to understand not just our weaknesses, but also our strengths. And I think if we can embrace humility as we're facing our challenges, that's going to really be a blessing to us and to those that are trying to walk beside us.
Well, hopefully our listeners got a sense of how great this book is. So if they want to get this book, how would they go about doing that. And if they wanted to contact you or learn more about what you do, give us some contact information, please.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to stay in touch with folks. So, please feel free to check out jamieaten.com. So that's my website. You'll find right as you hit the landing page, sign up for our weekly newsletter that I send out through the Humanitarian Disaster Institute. And you'll also find a number of free articles, like some of the ones that I've mentioned today about forgiveness. There's another one on self-compassion and forgiveness, survivor's guilt, and a number about my cancer journey. You can find out information about the book there as well. Also consider visiting our institute at wheaton.edu/HDI. Again, you'll find out more information about the book there and resources to not just help during personal disasters, but also mass disasters.
Yeah, and if you could send me that link for that article you mentioned earlier, I'll be sure to include that in the show notes along with those websites you just mentioned.
Great. And I'm also pretty active on Twitter, so feel free to reach out to me there.
Sounds good. Thanks for your time. Really enjoyed it. Have a great day.
Blessings.
All right, bye. Men at Work, I hope you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have. We just heard about Dr. Jamie Aten's journey being spirit-led and living out his Christian faith through his work. Each of our journeys are unique, but hopefully you've heard something in this episode to inspire you and give direction for your own personal daily work life. You can find links and other information from this show at davehilgendorf.com. Until next time, have a great day and God bless.